All right, chapter 39 is called The Book of God. The screws were tightening. Eric met with Andrea Sanchez to receive his diversion contract. He looked ahead to senior year. It would be consumed writing an apology letter, providing restitution, working off fines, meeting a diversion counselor twice a month, seeing his own shrink, attending bullshit classes like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, maintaining good grades, problem-free employment, and 45 hours of community service. They would periodically hand him a Dixie cup and direct him to a urinal. No more alcohol, no more freedom. Eric's first counseling session and his first drug test screening would commence in 8 days. He met with Sanchez on a Wednesday. Thursday, he stewed. Friday, April 10th, 1998, he opened a letter-sized spiral notebook and scribbled, "I hate the fucking world." In 1 year and 10 days, he would attack. Eric wrote furiously, filling 2 vicious pages. "People are stupid. I'm not respected. Everyone has their own goddamn opinions on every goddamn thing." At first glance, the journal sounds like the website, but Fuselier found answers in it. The website was pure rage, no explanation. The journal was explicit. Eric fleshed out his ideas on paper, as well as his personality. Eric had a preposterously grand superiority complex, a revulsion for authority, and an excruciating need for control. "I feel like God," Eric announced. "I am higher than almost anyone in the fucking world in terms of universal intelligence." In time, his superiority would be revealed. In the interim, Eric dubbed his journal The Book of God. The breadth of his hostility was equally melodramatic. And if you're doing the audiobook, just do the title, number 7, the name of the journal. Don't worry about writing down a quotation because there's a liar. Humans were pathetic fuckheads, too dense to perceive their lifeless existence. We frittered our lives away like automatons like robots, following orders rather than realizing our potential. "Ever wonder why we go to school?" he asked. "It's not too obvious to most of you stupid fucks, but for those who think a little more and deeper, you should realize it is society's way of turning all the young people into good little robots." Human nature was smothered by society. Healthy instincts were smothered by laws. They were training us to be assembly line robots. That's why they lined the school desks up in rows and trained kids to respond to opening and closing bells. The monotonous human assembly line squelched the life out of individual experience. As Eric put it, more of your human nature blown out your ass. Philosophically, the robotic conception was a rare point of agreement between the killers. Dylan referred often to zombies too. Both boys described their uniqueness as self-awareness. They could see through the human haze. But Dylan saw his distinction as a lonely curse, and he looked on the zombies compassionately. Dylan yearned for the poor little creatures to break out of their boxes. The problem, as Eric saw it, was natural selection. He had alluded to the concept on his website. Here he explained relentlessly. Natural selection had failed. Man had intervened. Medicines, vaccines, and special ed programs had conspired to keep the rejects in the human herd. So Eric was surrounded by inferiors who would not shut their freaking mouths. How could he tolerate all the miserable chatter? He had lots of ideas. Nuclear holocaust, biological warfare, imprisoning the species in a giant ultimate doom game. But Eric was also realistic. He couldn't restore the natural order, but he could impose some selection of his own. He would sacrifice himself to accomplish it. "I know I will die soon," he wrote. "So will you and everyone else." By soon, he meant a year. Eric had a remarkably long time horizon for a 17-year-old contemplating his own death. The lies jumped out at Fuselier. Eric took giddy pleasure in his deceptions. "I lie a lot," he wrote, "almost constant and to everybody, just to keep my own ass out of the water. Let's see, what are some big lies I have told? Yeah, I stopped smoking. For doing it, not getting caught. Being sorry for doing it, not getting caught. And no, I haven't been making more bombs." That's your answer to number 8. Eric did not believe in God, but he enjoyed comparing himself to him. Like Dylan, he did so frequently, but not delusionally. They were like God, superior in insight, intelligence, and awareness. Like Zeus, Eric created new rules, angered easily, and punished people in unusual ways. Eric had conviction. Eric had a plan. Eric would get the guns and build the explosives and maim and kill and so much more. They would terrify way beyond their gun blasts. The ultimate weapon was TV. Eric saw past the Columbine Commons. He might kill hundreds, but the dead and dismembered meant nothing to him. Bit players, who cared? The performance was not about them. Eric's one-day only production was about the audience. The irony was his attack was too good for his victims. It would sail right over their heads. The majority of the audience won't even understand, Eric lamented. Too bad. They would feel the power of his hand. If we have figured out the art of time bombs beforehand, we will set hundreds of them around houses, roads, bridges, buildings, and gas stations. It'll be like the LA riots, the Oklahoma bombing, World War II, Vietnam, Duke and Doom all mixed together. Maybe we will even start a little rebellion or revolution to fuck things up as much as we can. I want to leave a lasting impression on the world. Dr. Fuselier set down the journal. It had taken him about an hour to read that first time in the noisy Columbine band room 2 or 3 days after the murders. Now he had a pretty good hunch about what he was dealing with. A psychopath. That's the end of part 3. Here is part 4, Take Back the School, and chapter 40, which is called Psychopath. I will choose to kill, Eric wrote. Why? His explanations didn't add up. Because we were morons? How would that make a kid kill? To most readers, Eric's rants just sounded nuts. Dr. Fuselier had the opposite reaction. Insanity was marked by mental confusion. Eric Harris expressed cold, rational calculation. Fuselier ticked off Eric's personality traits. Charming, callous, cunning, manipulative, comically grandiose, and egocentric with an appalling failure of empathy. It was like reciting the psychopathy checklist. There's your answers to number 9. I think there were 7 there. Fuselier spent the next 12 weeks contesting his theory. That's how he approached the problem. Develop a hypothesis and then search for every scrap of evidence to refute it. Test it against alternate explanations, build the strongest possible case to support them, and see if the hypothesis fails. If it withstands that, it's solid. Psychopathy held. Diagnosis didn't solve the crime, but it laid the foundation. 10 years afterward, Eric still baffled the public, which insisted on assessing his motives through a normal lens. Eric was neither normal nor insane. Psychopathy represents a third category. Psychopathic brains don't function like those in either of other groups, but they are consistently similar to one another. Eric killed for 2 reasons: to demonstrate his superiority and to enjoy it. To a psychopath, both motives make sense. Psychopaths are capable of behavior that normal people find not only horrific, but baffling, wrote Dr. Robert Hare, the leading authority on psychopaths. They can torture and mutilate their victims with about the same sense of concern that we feel when we carve a turkey for Thanksgiving dinner. Eric saw humans as chemical compounds with an inflated sense of their own worth. It's all just nature, chemistry, and math, he wrote. You die, burn, melt, evaporate, decay. Psychopaths have likely plagued mankind since the beginning, but they are still poorly understood. In the 1800s, as the fledgling field of psychology began classifying mental disorders, one group refused to fit. Every known psychosis was marked by a failure of reasoning or a debilitating ailment, paralyzing fear, hallucinations, voices, phobias, and so on. In 1885, the term psychopath was introduced to describe vicious human predators who were not deranged, delusional, or depressed. They just enjoyed being bad. Psychopaths are distinguished by 2 characteristics. The first is a ruthless disregard for others. They will defraud, maim, or kill for the most trivial personal gain. The second is an astonishing gift for disguising the first. It's the deception that makes them so dangerous. You never see him coming. It's usually a him. More than 80% are male. Don't look for the oddball creeping you out. Psychopaths don't act like Hannibal Lecter or Norman Bates. They come off like Hugh Grant in his most adorable role. In 1941, Dr. Hervey Cleckley revolutionized the understanding of psychopathy with his book, The Mask of Sanity. Egocentrism and failure of empathy were the underlying drivers, but Cleckley chose his title to reflect the element that trumped those. If psychopaths were merely evil, they would not be a major threat. They wreak so much havoc that they should be obvious. Yet the majority have consistently eluded the law. Cleckley worried about his title metaphor. Psychopathy is not a 2-dimensional cover that can be lifted off the face like a Halloween mask. It permeates the offender's personality. Joy, grief, anxiety, or amusement. He can mimic any on cue. He knows the facial expressions, the voice modulation, and the body language. He's not just conning you with a scheme, he's conning you with his life. His entire personality is a fabrication with the purpose of deceiving suckers like you. Psychopaths take great personal pride in their deceptions and extract tremendous joy from them. Lies become the psychopath's occupation, and where the truth will work, they lie for sport. I like to con people, one of Hare's subjects told a researcher during an extended interview. I'm conning you right now. Lying for amusement is so profound in psychopaths, it stands out as their signature characteristic. Duping delight, psychologist Paul Ekman dubbed it. So there's your answer to first part of number 10. Cleckley spent 5 decades refining his research and publishing 4 further editions of The Mask of Sanity. It wasn't until the 1970s that Robert Hare isolated 20 characteristics of the condition and created the psychopathy checklist, the basis for virtually all contemporary research. He also wrote the definitive book on the malady, Without Conscience. The terminology got muckier. Sociopath was introduced in the 1930s, initially as a broader term for antisocial behavior. Eventually, psychopath and sociopath became virtually synonymous. So there's your second part of number 10. Varying definition for the latter had led to distinctions by some experts, but these are not uniformly accepted. The primary reason for competing terms is that each was adopted in different fields. Criminologists and law enforcement personnel prefer psychopaths. Sociologists tend toward sociopaths. Psychologists and psychiatrists are split, but most experts on the condition use psychopath, and the bulk of the research is based on Hare's checklist. A third term, antisocial personality disorder, or APD, was introduced in the 1970s and remains the only diagnosis included in the latest edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-IV. However, it covers a much broader range of disorders than does psychopath and has been roundly rejected by leading researchers. So where do psychopaths come from? Researchers are divided, with the majority suggesting a mixed role: nature leading, nurture following. Dr. Hare believes psychopaths are born with a powerful predisposition which can be exacerbated, like set on or triggered, by abuse or neglect, or made worse by abuse or neglect. A correlation exists between psychopaths and unstable homes, and violent upbringings seem to turn fledgling psychopaths more vicious. But current data suggest those conditions do not cause the psychopathy. They only make a bad situation worse. It also appears that even the best parenting may be no match for a child born to be bad. So there is number 11. Symptoms appear so early and so often in stable homes with normal siblings that the condition seems to be inborn. Most parents report having been aware of disturbing signs before the child entered kindergarten. Dr. Hare described a 5-year-old girl repeatedly attempting to flush her kitten down the toilet. I caught her just as she was about to try again, the mother said. She seemed quite unconcerned, maybe a bit angry about being found out. When the woman told her husband, the girl calmly denied the whole thing. Shame did not register, neither did fear. Psychopaths are not individuals losing touch with those emotions. They never developed them from the start. Hare created a separate screening device for juveniles and identified hallmarks that appear during the school years: gratuitous lying, indifference to the pain of others, defiance of authority figures, unresponsiveness to reprimands or threatened punishment, petty theft, persistent aggression, cutting classes and breaking curfew, cruelty to animals, early experimentation with sex, and vandalism and setting fires. Eric bragged about 9 of the 10 hallmarks in his journal and on his website. For most of them, relentlessly. Only animal cruelty is missing. And there is number 12. At some point, as either a cause or an effect of psychopathy, the psychopath's brain begins processing emotional responses differently. Early in his career, Dr. Hare recognized the anatomical difference. He submitted a paper analyzing the unusual brain waves of a psychopath to a scientific journal which rejected it with a dismissive letter. Those EEGs couldn't have come from real people, the editor wrote. Exactly, Hare thought. Psychopaths are that different. Eric Harris baffled the public because we could not conceive of a human with his motives. Even Kate Batten would describe him as a teenager trying to act like an adult. But the angst we associate with teenagers was the least of Eric's drives. His brain was never scanned, but it probably would have shown activity unrecognizable as human to most neurologists. The fundamental nature of a psychopath is a failure to feel. A psychopath's grasp of fear and suffering is particularly weak. Dr. Hare's research team spent decades studying psychopaths in prison populations. They asked one psychopath to describe fear. When I rob a bank, I notice that the teller shakes or becomes tongue-tied, he said. One barfed all over the money. He found that puzzling. The researcher pushed him to describe his own fear. How would he feel with a gun pointed at him? The convict said he might hand over the money, get the hell out, or find a way to turn the tables. Those are responses, the researcher said. How would you feel? Feel? Why would he feel? Researchers often compare psychopaths to robots or rogue computers like HAL from 2001: A Space Odyssey, programmed only to satisfy their own objectives. That's the closest approximation of their behavior, but the metaphor lacks nuance. Psychopaths feel something. Eric seemed to show sadness when his dog was sick, and he occasionally felt twinges of regret toward humans. But the signals come through dimly. Cleckley described this as a poverty of emotional range. That's a tricky concept because psychopaths develop a handful of primitive emotions closely related to their own welfare. 3 have been identified: anger, frustration, and rage. So there is your answer to number 13. Psychopaths erupt with ferocious bouts of anger, which can get them labeled emotional. Look more closely, Cleckley advised. The conviction dawns on those who observe him carefully that here we deal with a readiness of expression rather than a strength of feeling. No love, no grief, not even sorrow, really, or hope or despair about his own future. Psychopaths feel nothing deep, complex, or sustained. The psychopath was prone to vexation, spite, quick and labile flashes of quasi-affection, peevish resentment, shallow moods of self-pity, puerile attitudes of vanity, absurd and showy poses of indignation. Cleckley could have been describing Eric Harris's journal. How dare you think that I and you are part of the same species? We are so different, Eric wrote. You aren't human. You are a robot. And if you pissed me off in the past, you will die if I see you. Indignation runs strong in the psychopath. It springs from a staggering ego and sense of superiority. Psychopaths do not feel much, but when they lose patience with inferiors, they can really let it rip. It doesn't go any deeper. Even an earthworm will recoil if you poke it with a stick. A squirrel will exhibit frustration if you tease it by offering it a peanut, then repeatedly snatching it back. Psychopaths make it that far up the emotional ladder, but they fall far short of the average golden retriever, which will demonstrate affection, joy, compassion, and empathy for a human in pain. Researchers are still just beginning to understand psychopaths, but they believe psychopaths crave the emotional responses they lack. They are nearly always thrill seekers. They love roller coasters and hang gliding, and they seek out high anxiety occupations like ER tech, bond trader, or marine. Crime, danger, impoverishment, death, any sort of risk will help. They chase new sources of excitement because it is so difficult for them to sustain. They rarely stick with a career, they get bored. Even as career criminals, psychopaths underperform. They, quote, lack clear goals and objectives, getting involved in a wide variety of opportunistic offenses rather than specializing the way typical career criminals do, Cleckley wrote. They make careless mistakes and pass up stunning opportunities because they lose interest. They perform spectacularly in short bursts, a few weeks, a few months, a year-long big con, then walk away. Eric spent his young life that way. He should have been a 4.0 student, but collected A's, B's, and C's. He made 1 year-long commitment to NBK, but he had no ambition, zero plans for his life. He was one of the smartest kids in his high school, but apparently never bothered to apply for college. No job prospects either beyond blackjack. Despite a childhood of soldier fantasies, a military father, and a stated desire for a career in the Marines, Eric made no attempt to enlist. When a recruiter cold called him during the last week of his life, he met the guy, but never returned the call to find out whether he had been approved. Rare killer psychopaths nearly always get bored with murder, too. When they slit a throat, their pulse races, but it falls just as fast. It stays down. No more joy from cutting throats for a while. That thrill has already been spent. A second, less common approach to the banality of murder seems to be the dyad, murderous pairs who feed off each other. Criminologists have been aware of the dyad phenomenon for decades. Leopold and Loeb, Bonnie and Clyde, the Beltway snipers of 2002. Because dyads account for only a fraction of mass murderers, little research has been conducted on them. We know that the partnerships tend to be asymmetrical. An angry, erratic depressive and a sadistic psychopath make a combustible pair. The psychopath is in control, of course, but the hot-headed sidekick can sustain his excitement leading up to the big kill. So there is number 14. It takes heat and cold to make a tornado, Dr. Fuselier is fond of saying. Eric craved heat, but he couldn't sustain it. Dylan was a volcano. You could never tell when he might erupt. Day after day, for more than a year, Dylan juiced Eric with erratic jolts of excitement. They played the killing out again and again, the cries, the screams, the smell of burning flesh. Eric savored the anticipation. Dr. Hare's EEGs suggested the psychopathic brain operates differently, but he could not be sure how or why. After Eric's death, the colleague advanced our understanding with a new technology. Functional magnetic resonance imaging tests, MRIs, or fMRIs, create a picture of the brain with light indicating active regions. Dr. Kent Keel wired subjects up and showed them a series of flashcards. Half contained emotionally charged words like rape, murder, and cancer. The others were neutral, like rock and doorknob. Normal people found the disturbing words disturbing. The brain's emotional nerve center, called the amygdala, lit up. The psychopathic amygdala were dark. The emotional flavors that color our days are invisible to psychopaths. Dr. Keel repeated the experiment with pictures, including graphic shots of homicides. Again, psychopaths' amygdala were unaffected, but the language center activated. They seem to be analyzing the emotions instead of experiencing them. He responds to events that others find arousing, repulsive, or scary with the words interesting and fascinating, Dr. Hare said. For psychopaths, horror is purely intellectual. Their brains search for words to describe what the rest of us would feel. That fits the profile. Psychopaths react to pain or tragedy by assessing how they can use the situation to manipulate others. So what's the treatment for psychopathy? Dr. Hare summarized the research on a century of attempts in 2 words. Nothing works. And there is kind of the answer is number 15, but there's another treatment coming up here. But nothing works. It is the only major mental affliction to elude treatment, and therapy often makes it worse. Unfortunately, programs of this sort merely provide the psychopath with better ways of manipulating, deceiving, and using people, Hare wrote. Individual therapy can be a bonanza, one-on-one training to perfect the performance. These programs are like a finishing school, a psychopath boasted to Dr. Hare's team. They teach you how to put the squeeze on people. Eric was blessed with at least 2 unintentional coaches, Bob Kriegshauser in the juvenile diversion program and his psychiatrist, Dr. Albert. Eric was a quick study. The notes in his diversion file document a study improvement session by session. Oddly, a large number of psychopaths spontaneously improve around middle age. The phenomenon has been observed for decades, but not explained. Otherwise, psychopaths appear to be lost causes. Within the psychiatric community, that has drawn stiff resistance to diagnosing minors with the condition. But clearly, many juveniles are well on their way. Dr. Keel has a mobile fMRI lab and a research team funded by the University of New Mexico. He mapped about 500 brains at 3 prison systems in 2008. Because of the skewed sample pool, about 20% met the criteria for psychopathy. He believes that answers about the causes and treatment of psychopathy are coming within reach. While Eric was devising his attack, Dr. Hare was working on a regimen to address his kind. Hare began by re-examining the data on those spontaneous improvers. From adolescents to their 50s, psychopaths showed virtually no change in emotional characteristics, but improved dramatically in antisocial behavior. The inner drives did not change, but their behavior did. Hare believes that these psychopaths might simply be adapting. Fiercely rational, they figured out that prison was not working for them. So Hare proposed using their self-interest to the public advantage. The program he developed accepts that psychopaths will remain egocentric and uncaring for life, but will adhere to rules if it's in their own interest. Convincing them that there are ways that they can get what they want without harming others is the key, Hare said. You say to them, most people think with their hearts, not with their heads. And your problem is you think too much with your head. So let's change the problem into an asset. And they understand that. And that's sort of the last part of Nerve 15 is convincing them they can get what they want without hurting others. While Eric was in high school, a juvenile treatment center in Wisconsin began a program developed independently but based on that approach. It also addressed the psychopathic drives for instant gratification and control. Subjects were rated every night on adherence to rules and rewarded with extended privileges the next day. The program was not designed specifically for fledgling psychopaths, but it produced significant improvements in that population. A 4-year study published in 2006 concluded that they were 2.7 times less likely to become violent than kids with similar psychopathy scores in other programs. For the first time in the history of psychopathy, a treatment appears to have worked. It awaits replication. Psychopathy experts are cautiously optimistic about coming advances. I believe that within 10 years, we will have a much better perspective on psychopathy than we do now, Dr. Keel said. Ideally, we will be able to help effectively manage the condition. I would not say that there is a cure on the horizon, but I do hope that we can implement effective management strategies. That's the end of chapter 20. Keep calm and English on.